Our guest is Mr. Dernberger of route number 2, Mineral Wells, West Virginia. Mr. Dernberger has a very interesting story to tell us this evening. I will give you a thumbnail sketch to begin with. Whether or not you believe in unidentified flying objects or not is not the point. Whether you believe in what you hear or see on this program is not the point. We are here to talk to a man that allegedly did make contact with such an object within the Parkersburg area last evening, November the 2nd, 1966, at approximately 7:25 p.m. The incident allegedly took place on Interstate Highway 77 near the interchange of route number 47. This gentleman is a salesman in the area. He has been a resident of the area for the past 50 years, and he has given us permission to interview him, to show his face, and to call him by name. This in itself takes a lot of initiative, and to be very plain, a lot of know-how.
It seems like every other day, I read a story involving eyewitness testimony and the faults behind it. Police investigators and psychologists have insisted that eyewitness testimony is not a guaranteed thing, and that the human mind is perceptible to being influenced. By what exactly depends on the person and the position they find themselves in. But when we hear about many people seeing the same thing, we tend to believe them. Many police cases, normally left adrift without the aid of physical evidence, can be guided or even driven entirely by the support of witnesses. As a species, we tend to believe it when multiple people claim to have seen the same thing. However, what happens when a large group of people claim to have seen something too outrageous, too ridiculous for our minds to comprehend? What happens when an entire town sees something that nobody else has ever seen? Do we believe them? Are they victims of mass hysteria, simply buying into whatever their neighbor was selling? Or is there something more mysterious afoot? Something paranormal? Something otherworldly? This is the story of Point Pleasant. Welcome to the Unresolved Podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and on this episode of the show, I'll be diving into a story that is a far cry from the two I have previously covered. This podcast will look into the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the events that unfolded in the years of 1966 and 1967. While the major events have been widely publicized in the following decades, many of the smaller details have been forgotten in time, or simply lost among the surrounding hysteria. I know that some of you will be disappointed in the paranormal nature of this podcast, but this is a story that has always kept me yearning for more. So hopefully my curiosity can rub off on you in some small way, and hopefully get you interested in some unresolved cases outside of true crime. If you are disappointed that I'm not peeking behind the curtain of a psychopathic criminal, then rest easy knowing that I'll be back at it next episode. But for now, we jump back to the mid-1960s and head to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Point Pleasant is a small town situated alongside the Ohio River. Originally established as a military fort in 1774, Point Pleasant gained notoriety for the battle that took place on its grounds. At the time, the area was unsettled by white colonists and became a point of contention between the reigning Lord Dunmore and the local Native Americans. Many would go on to consider the Battle of Point Pleasant a part of the Revolutionary War, but it stands as a major tipping point in Lord Dunmore's much smaller war. The leader of the Native American army, who went by the name of Chief Cornstalk, would later go on to be betrayed and murdered by Virginians under the guise of peace talks, and buried in what is now Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The mysterious events surrounding Point Pleasant began on November 2nd, 1966. Point Pleasant had grown into a small town of just a few thousand people, a town steeped in history and the type of place where everyone knew one another. Woodrow Derenberger was a traveling salesman that lived in Mineral Wells, another small town about an hour northeast of Point Pleasant. Point Pleasant lies on the Ohio River, across which Woodrow was working on in this particular night. He was driving down Interstate 77 when the mysterious events began to unfold, and I think I'll just let him explain it for you.
Mr. Derenberger, in your own words, would you please relate what happened last night?
Well, I am a salesman, and I drive a truck. And last night, shortly after 7 o'clock, I was coming from Marietta, Ohio, coming down Interstate 77. And just before I came to the intersection of Route 47, there was a car past me, overtaking me from behind. And following closely behind this car was this unidentified flying object. And as the car behind passed me, this object was following close behind it, and it swerved directly in front of my truck, turning crosswise. And when it turned crosswise, it slowed down. It started slowing not abruptly or too fast, but it gave me plenty of time to step on my brakes and slow down with it. But it forced me to come to a complete stop. As soon as I had stopped, there was a door opened in the side of this vehicle, and this man stepped out and came directly to me, or came to the truck. He walked to the right-hand side of the truck, and he told me to roll down the window. He asked me to roll down the window on my right-hand side of my truck. And I had done what he asked. And this man stood there, and he first asked me what I was called, and I knew he meant my name, and I told him my name. And he asked me, he said, why are you frightened? He said, don't be frightened, we wish you no harm. He said, we mean you no harm, we wish you only happiness. And I told him my name, and when I told him my name, he said he was called Cold. That was the name that he was called by. And he asked me what the city of Parkersburg, he pointed to the lights. He didn't point, but he gave the impression that he was pointing, and he asked me what that was called. And I told him it was Parkersburg. It was a city, a town. And he asked me if most all the people lived in this city or town. And I explained to him that it was a place of business. It's where we transacted our business, that the people lived in communities, outlying communities, most of the people. And when I told him that this was a city, he said that where his home was, that was called a gathering. And again, he told me not to be frightened, which I was. I was very frightened. And as far as I can understand, this was all mental. There was no spoken words from him. I knew what he was asking me, but yet he stood there and his mouth did not move. He had a smile on his face. He appeared very courteous and friendly. And after I talked with him a while, he told me he would see me. He said, "We will see you again," and he left in his vehicle.
That was Woodrow Derenberger himself, retelling his version of events from November 2nd, 1966. He claims that at around 7:30 p.m., while traveling home, he was stopped by the bright lights of a car-like vehicle that hovered inches above the ground. According to Derenberger's testimony, this vehicle passed him on the road, before pulling in front of his own car and causing him to slam on his brakes. This is where the suspension of disbelief goes out the window for most people. The claims that there exists a human-like alien named Cold, who speaks to Derenberger telepathically, is just too unrealistic to believe. It's something that many ascribe to the time period itself, which was fraught with claims of UFO sightings and extraterrestrial-driven flying saucers. But Derenberger was in full belief of his claims on this clear November night. He believes that this alien, shaped like a man, named Cold, visited him and talked for a few minutes before departing, leaving their conversation with the parting words of, "We'll be speaking again." It's interesting to note that this sighting was reported the night of the supposed encounter, which is when Derenberger contacted the police and his local media. The interview you just heard took place the very next day, which just so happens to be when things start to become weird for the area of Point Pleasant. It's easy to look at a claim like Derenberger's and dismiss it as fiction. In fact, that's what almost everyone has done in the decades since. Woodrow Derenberger was a 50-year-old sewing machine salesman who was married with multiple children. Judging him with most metrics, he was living the American dream and had no record of making claims like these. By all indications, Derenberger was just an average guy you could expect to find in West Virginia in the mid-1960s. But these claims brought his reputation, his name, and even his sanity into question. His claims, however ridiculous sounding, were big news in this small area of the American Northeast, and he found himself put in a spotlight for public scrutiny. Many began to camp outside his house, hiding in trees or in the shadows, hoping to find some trace of these UFOs. Others began to criticize him for losing his mind, threatening to tear apart his family. People who lived in the area where he claimed to have had this encounter reported similar sightings. None had claimed to encounter the telepath-speaking man named Cold, but some had seen bright lights in the sky on the night of November 2nd. These lights supposedly moved far quicker than any man-made craft known at the time, and seemed to stop and go, occasionally floating, in a manner that would seem impossible even to this day. Derenberger claimed to communicate with Cold again, just days afterwards, but these communications took place solely in Derenberger's mind. He claims that Cold was able to communicate with him despite not being nearby physically, and he learned some more information about Cold and his homeworld, named Lanilos. Derenberger would later go on to write a memoir about his encounters with Cold, titled Visitors from Lanilos, which would go on to be published in a very limited manner in 1971. However, Derenberger would spend the rest of his life defending his sanity and his livelihood from claims of insanity. He never claimed anything further, his supposed conversations with Cold drawing to a close in 1966. But unfortunately, those few weeks of fame would cause him to lose his job, his marriage, and even custody of his children. Despite his entire life falling apart over the next few years, Derenberger would never recant his claims. He personally considered his claims to be his version of the truth, that he had communicated with the Grinning Man, an alien presence he claimed never brought good news. The local area was full of claims supporting Derenberger's timeline of events, people claiming to have seen bright lights in the sky. But on November 12th, things took an interesting turn. There were 5 men working as gravediggers in the nearby town of Clendenin, about an hour southeast of Point Pleasant. These 5 men claimed to see a large winged creature emerge from a nearby patch of trees, taking flight. This creature, which was shaped more like a man with wings than a type of recognized bird, quickly flew over atop the 5 of them, coming close enough to either scare or intimidate. This would be just the first sighting of the creature known as the Mothman, but it wouldn't be the last. Three days later, on November 15th, a man named Newell Partridge was sitting at home, watching television. The time was approximately 10:30 in the evening, so all was quiet and dark around him in the small town of Salem, West Virginia. For reference, Salem is about 2 hours away from Point Pleasant, further northeast than Woodrow Derenberger's home of mineral wells. A loud whining noise breaks out from outside Partridge's farmhouse. Immediately, his TV screen cuts to static, weird patterns and figures emerging from the screen. Partridge would later describe the loud metallic whining sound as being similar to the sound of a generator starting up. Partridge's dog, a German shepherd named Bandit, began to bark and make his way to the door. Partridge opened the door for Bandit and himself, hoping to investigate the cause of the sound and the television interruption. Armed with only a flashlight, Partridge follows an eager Bandit to the barn, which is located about 500 feet away from the house. Partridge shines the light on the barn, finding only big, red eyes staring at him in return. Newell Partridge ran back to his house, hoping to grab his gun, but by the time he had it in hand, he realized that he was too terrified to go back outside and face whatever had been looking back at him. According to the rumors that have persisted to this day, Newell Partridge never saw his dog, Bandit, ever again. That wasn't the only sighting that would be seen of the supposed Mothman on this night, however. He would be spotted back near Point Pleasant, over 100 miles away, just an hour or so later. During World War II, a section of the woods outside of Point Pleasant became home to the West Virginia Ordnance Works. This organization was in charge of manufacturing and storing explosives for the war effort. They stockpiled many of the explosives in steel bunkers known as igloos to many of the Point Pleasant locals. However, in the decades after the war, the explosives remained in the bunkers and the area was reclaimed by nature. To this day, many of the bunkers remain untouched, and this has become known as the TNT area to many of the people in the Point Pleasant area. On this night, November 15th, 2 young married couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallett, were visiting the TNT area. We can all guess at what these two couples were there for, but they were young, and it reasons that young people enjoy going to places like this. The TNT area was located in a larger, heavily wooded wildlife area, which itself was starting to become known as the local Lover's Lane. But a short time after Newell Partridge's encounter with the Mothman hours away, these couples would have their own. While they were driving towards their destination, late at night, the couples in the car spotted a large presence just outside a power plant. By their descriptions, this presence stood well over the height of an average man, with great bat-like wings folded behind his back. All four of them had similar recollections, but made extra note of the creature's large, red eyes. The couples then sped off, frightened by the sight of this mysterious creature, heading back to Point Pleasant in a single car. The couples apparently reached upwards of 100 miles per hour on the freeway, but the creature easily kept pace with them. According to these four, the creature flew alongside or just above them, his red eyes haunting them most of the way home. When the Scarberries and the Mallets began to draw close to the town of Point Pleasant, the creature seemed to back off. The two couples, still fearing for their lives, raced to the nearby courthouse, where they encountered Deputy Sheriff Millard Halstead. As I've mentioned before, Point Pleasant is the type of small town where everyone knows one another. Halstead was familiar with the two young couples, and he knew that whatever was panicking them was something to be taken seriously. He listened to their recollection of events, and surprisingly, took it as truth. This is when the legend of the Mothman was born, and the area of Point Pleasant would never be the same again. Following the panicked story from the Scarberries and the Mallets, the town of Point Pleasant held a press conference to assure the citizens of their safety. After all, these sightings were nothing more than modern ghost stories, explainable by hysteria getting the better of some impressionable young people. At this press conference, the town leadership introduced the likelihood that the creature these couples had seen was none other than a sandhill crane. Sandhill cranes are large birds, with skinny legs, but a wingspan that could span up to 6 feet. Sandhill cranes are also noticeable for their amberish, red eyes that can appear much darker in certain light. These cranes are known to frequent many areas in North America throughout the year, so it's a valid explanation for this phenomenon. The sandhill crane is also used as an explanation for the popular Jersey Devil myth, in addition to others. However, the Scarberries and the Mallets reiterated how much the figure they had seen looked like something else. They described it as having the arms and legs of a man, with bat-like wings, and red eyes that were so large they distracted them from seeing anything else of the creature's head. The two couples described this creature as an abnormally fast flyer, with a somewhat clumsy running motion. The night of this press conference, a group of armed men went into the woods nearby the TNT area, hoping to find or hunt this alleged creature. The local press, making light of the situation, decided to mockingly name this creature Mothman, as if it were a villain on the Adam West Batman television series. Despite the best intentions of Point Pleasant, the abnormal stories coming from this area of West Virginia began to attract people from around the nation. Among them was aspiring author and journalist John Keel.
Our next guest is a Fortean, and we'll find out exactly what that is from him. He is also the editor-in-chief of Pursuit magazine. Welcome, please, John Keel. John, how are you? So you're a Fortean, eh?
Oh, well, I've been trying to outgrow it. Actually,
what is a Fortean? It's spelled F-O-R-T-E-A-N. What is that?
Back in the early part of the century, there was a man named Charles Fort who spent his entire life in the New York Public Library, going through the old scientific journals and old newspapers, and he published a series of books about strange things that turned up in these old journals, like when it would rain frogs in France, or red snow in Switzerland. He kept track of all these things, did a series of books, and we started calling these events Fortean events.
I see.
And today we still keep track.
Now, the two examples you cited there, I've heard of raining the frogs, and it's always a matter of, it's either one, an old wives' tale. Remember the time it rained wives' tales?
Yes.
Or it's disputed in some, they could just say, well, there were frogs in the trees. When it rained, they jumped out.
Well, we have compiled a list of several thousand mysterious things that have fallen from the sky. They documented things. They include things like stone pillars, cannonballs, all kinds of strange things. In China, it once rained raw meat.
No,
no. There's no explanation.
When in China did it rain raw meat?
Well, quite a while ago. It was in the 19th century.
Now, how is it that all the unexplained things took place in the 19th century or before?
They're still taking place.
Give me a recent unexplained thing, other than Amazing Al.
Every January and February, here in the Northeast, we have what we call skyquakes. They get into the papers sometimes. Now, recently, they've been blaming the Concorde for this. But this has been going on. We've been keeping track of this since about 1840.
What is a skyquake?
It's an explosion in the sky. We have no explanation for it. We've got a lot of pseudo-explanations.
Well, how do we know when we hear one or see one?
Because it's like when a jet plane passes over at, Mach 2. It's like breaking the sound barrier. It's an explosion that sometimes shatters windows, and so on. And this has been going on in Connecticut, for example. The Indians had legends about this going way back. So this has been going on for a very long time, but every time it happens, the scientists come up with a new far-fetched explanation for it.
What is the most common or daily unexplained occurrence? I mean, something that we would all say, yeah, that's that thing, we can't explain it. What?
Well, we don't necessarily have daily occurrences, but in recent years, the UFO phenomenon has been very common around the world. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's going on in Argentina. And while a lot of people think they have an explanation for it, actually, we're just beginning to find out what's really going on with the UFO phenomenon.
UFOs are pretty much, I would guess, if we asked the audience, we'd probably find over half of them said, yeah, they have reason to believe there's something going on out there, I think.
At least 10% of them have probably seen one themselves.
Has anybody here ever seen one of these things? People applaud if you've seen one. And how many of you think there may be something visiting us?
That was author John Keel being interviewed by a very young David Letterman over 3 decades ago. During the 1960s, John Keel was an up-and-coming writer who specialized in writing abstract, abnormal stories. A former Army veteran who served in the Korean War, Keel was no stranger to facing the unknown. He had begun to specialize in writing stories about the weird and the peculiar, even writing teleplays for a number of TV shows in the 60s. But in the fall of 1966, Keel was focusing on the burgeoning UFO phenomenon that was sweeping the nation. While he began to write about these UFO sightings that were happening daily all over the globe, he decided to focus on one hotspot of activity, thus leading him to Point Pleasant, West Virginia.
About a generation ago, and it gives me the shudders to think that it was a generation ago, I was running around the country, sitting up all night in cemeteries, and sitting on hilltops in remote parts of the country, looking for these funny lights in the sky that were everywhere in the 1960s. There was one hilltop in particular that overlooked the Ohio River, where at that time there was a lot of boat traffic on the Ohio River day and night. And these funny lights would come down out of the sky and circle around these boats that were transporting cargo up the Ohio River. And the boatmen would turn on their searchlights and play games with these lights. The lights would jump out of the way of the searchlights. And I was sitting on my hilltop watching these games going on. And I would flash this flashlight at these funny lights, and they would jump out of the way of my flashlight. And so I'd flash in Morse code at these lights, and they would do whatever I ordered them to do. And then later, I decided that instead of using Morse code, I'd make up my own code. And they knew this code, which gave me a lot of concern at the time. And I gradually figured out during this period that we could control these so-called flying saucers. They weren't saucers, they were lights. And I was sitting alone, and one of these lights came down very close to my car and passed over, there was a wooded area all around me. These hills were all wooded hills. And it passed over these woods, and it seemed to descend right into the forest right next to my car. And the next day when I woke up in my motel room there, my eyes were very sore, like they were full of sand. And this is a common effect of looking at these lights. It's called conjunctivitis. It's like looking into a bright arc light. And so the fact that my eyes were affected was proof that I had seen something there. Now, in the years 1964 to 1968, there was a worldwide epidemic of these lights. And I don't mean that it was an occasional light in the sky. They were everywhere, every damn night of the week. Time magazine did big editorials about it. The New York Times did front-page stories about it. Now, I realized that the best way to tackle this was to pick one or two spots and make them a microcosm of the whole thing, and just study everything in that spot. Learn to know the people, study every event that happened, whether it was related to these things or not. We call them UFOs, but that's really not a good name for them. They were like living lights. These lights had an intelligence of their own. I made Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sort of my headquarters in '66.
Over the next year, Keel interviewed over 100 witnesses of the Mothman, with all of the supposed sightings occurring in or around the Point Pleasant area. Most of the stories remained the same, that this creature was incredibly large, in the shape of a man with a colossal wingspan, and had large red eyes that either entrance or intimidate to a dangerous degree. One of these sightings occurred just a day after the Scarberry and Mallet sighting on November 16th. On this night, a bright red light was spotted in the sky above the TNT area, close to the home of the Ralph Thomas family. A neighboring friend of the Thomas family, named Marcella Bennett, drove to the Thomas family's house to try and find out the cause of the glowing red light. When she got out of her car, she went to collect her child from the back seat, but was startled by the movement of something on the ground next to her. It seemed as though it had been lying down, she would later recount. She continued. It rose up slowly from the ground, a big gray thing, bigger than a man with terrible glowing eyes. Apparently, this Mothman began to walk towards Marcella, and she froze. According to her, she even dropped her young child for a moment, before recovering and racing towards the nearby house, which let her in. The story continues, in that both Marcella Bennett and the Thomas family hid inside, even as the Mothman creature paced around their patio, peeking into windows with his large, red eyes. It wasn't until the police arrived that the creature had finally dispersed, leaving the entire Thomas family terrified, and Marcella Bennett legitimately traumatized. Marcella Bennett would spend the next few months going through some extensive therapy sessions, apparently so traumatized that she had issues functioning normally in her own home. She was so terrified of what she had seen, and the unfortunate part is that very few would actually believe her. Many in the Point Pleasant area considered her just a part of the hoax, despite her very real health and well-being concerns that would follow. She wasn't alone though. The Thomas family she had been visiting backed up her claims, reiterating exactly what she had claimed to see, and they were just two of the hundreds of alleged witnesses to the Mothman creature, many of whom would be interviewed by Keel over the next year or so. John Keel would stay in the Point Pleasant area for about a year, diving further into the case than he ever could have imagined. He began to connect the local UFO sightings and the Mothman creature to a number of animal mutilations that had been happening in the surrounding area, making this one of the focal points of his writing. In 1967, Keel was also the one who began to popularize the term Men in Black, referring to the alleged government boogeymen that began to visit Point Pleasant in earnest. Keel began to take note of weird occurrences happening to himself and others connected to the story. Mailed documents changing overnight. Phone lines going dead or being tapped. UFO witnesses feeling threatened, etc. He began to attribute these sporadic events to the alleged Men in Black, believing that they were trying to silence the story, or at least the witnesses. These Men in Black would remain a consistent part of the Mothman story. Throughout his months in Point Pleasant, one of Keel's main acquaintances was a reporter named Mary Heyer. Heyer worked for the Athens Messenger, a local newspaper for Athens, Ohio, a town about 40 miles directly north of Point Pleasant. The Athens Messenger had a sister newspaper in Point Pleasant, and that's how Heyer became involved in the reporting on the Mothman. She was just as interested in the Mothman and UFO sightings as Keel was, but was coming at it from a much more localized, mature point of view. In the latter half of 1967, the interest in the Mothman case was beginning to die down, so Keel began to spend less and less time in Point Pleasant. He would return occasionally to get an interview with a new witness or two, but he wasn't spending as much time as he had in the first part of the year. During one of these return trips, it was Mary Heyer that picked Keel up at the airport. She told him that on a night shortly before his return, she had had a terrible nightmare of people drowning among Christmas presents. It was easy to excuse that as a silly nightmare, but John Keel was sure to take note of it for his later writings. Just a few weeks later, after returning to his home in New York, Keel began to have strange premonitions of his own. He would claim that he personally began to get messages from the long-forgotten Cold, the alien masquerading as a man. He claimed that these messages were delivered through his telephone, and they warned him to stay away from Point Pleasant. Obviously, we can't verify whether this was the truth, but Keel was away from Point Pleasant during the final weeks of 1967, and it may have saved his life. On December 15th, 1967, tragedy struck Point Pleasant. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, amidst rush hour traffic, the 700-foot Silver Bridge, crossing from Point Pleasant over the Ohio River, collapsed. Dozens of cars fell into the freezing cold river below, ultimately killing 46 people, 2 of which were never found. Multiple others suffered injuries or trauma at the hand of the bridge collapse, many of the victims having been witnesses of the Mothman creature. Constructed in 1928, the Silver Bridge had long exceeded its expected lifespan without any serious upkeep, having been used to carry loads much heavier than originally anticipated. Regardless of any paranormal happenings, the Silver Bridge collapse was a serious tragedy that brought to light just how seriously maintenance is needed to maintain human safety. But in the days and weeks following the bridge collapse, news media was all over the scene and Point Pleasant once again. The narrative began to spread that the Mothman was himself responsible for the bridge collapse, or that he had been spotted by certain witnesses the day of the collapse. Many claimed to have seen the Mothman earlier in the day or the morning of the tragedy, an omen of things to come. However, the Mothman was never spotted in Point Pleasant again by any sum of people. It was as if, on the evening of December 15th, the presence of the Mothman had died along with the victims of the Silver Bridge collapse. Despite the bridge collapse marking an end to the Mothman sightings, the town of Point Pleasant wasn't entirely done with weird happenings. Mary Hyre, the reporter for the Athens Messenger that was now acting as the Point Pleasant correspondent, saw her workload increase drastically in the weeks and months following the bridge collapse. Originally enticed by the sightings involving the Mothman, Hyre turned her focus on those involving the dancing lights in the sky, which continued even after the bridge collapse. On one weekend, shortly after the bridge tragedy, she recalled getting over 500 phone calls from local citizens who reported seeing these lights in the sky. But on one evening in January of 1968, weeks after the collapse drew attention to the area, Mary was visited by a strange man in her office. It was late at night, and Mary's office in the Point Pleasant courthouse didn't really receive any visitors. This man, who was described as very short with an oddly shaped, long-haired bowl cut, wore thick glasses, and had what Mary would describe as a hypnotic gaze. The man terrified Mary Hyre, as he spoke in a low voice full of stutters and stammers. He wasn't interested at all in the bridge collapse or the Mothman sightings, but he was very interested in finding out who exactly had spotted lights in the sky. He wanted to know who these witnesses were, and presumably where they lived. During their brief conversation, this man kept inching closer and closer to Mary, who was beginning to feel very threatened. She called out for her boss, who rushed into her office in a hurry. This man turned to leave. However, he paused and picked up a pen from her desk, as if he had never seen one before. Laughing, he kept it and ran out of the office. Rumors claimed that this same man visited many houses in the area, homes of those who had spotted the lights in the sky. According to these rumors, he made all of them feel uncomfortable, and he claimed to be a reporter from Ohio. However, he apparently knew nothing of the Ohio area, and just simply disappeared as soon as he had arrived. We can only guess at the identity of this man, or whether he even existed. But it goes without saying that this was a very weird occurrence that had unfolded after a tragedy in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Point Pleasant would never be the same again. The tragedy had a major impact on the town in the following years, changing it overnight. Gone was the wild-eyed optimism of the 1960s UFO craze, instead replaced with the town's somber icon of tragedy, the Mothman. In the following years, the Mothman would become a thing of urban legend, a dark omen of things to come. In 1971, more than 3 years after the tragedy, an investigation into the bridge collapse came up with the reason. A small defect to the bridge's suspension eye-bar, less than 1/10 of an inch deep, had been the culprit of the collapse itself, setting off a chain of events that would eventually take the lives of 46 people. This would eventually lead to an overhaul of the maintenance standards for states all around the country. In 1975, almost 10 years later, John Keel brought the Mothman legend back to life with the release of his book, The Mothman Prophecies. It detailed his descent into madness as the events of 1966 and 1967 unfold, and can be seen as a book about one man's paranoid delusion. It has become the main reference source for many who believe in the Mothman myth, but even I will admit that it is incredibly hard to read without a truly open mind. Point Pleasant would mourn, and eventually recover from the terrible tragedy that left dozens of their neighbors dead, but it would forever be changed. Over the years, the city began to recover and reclaim their town from the paranormal claims that had taken it over, but the whispers of the Mothman or UFOs would never truly leave. The town of Point Pleasant is now synonymous with the Mothman legend, with several museums and stores selling Mothman merchandise in the town itself. In 2002, a generation after the tragic bridge collapse, the town of Point Pleasant began to celebrate its annual Mothman Festival. This happened to coincide with the release of a movie titled The Mothman Prophecies, loosely based off of Keel's book. Starring Richard Gere, the movie was a fictionalized look at events surrounding the Silver Bridge collapse, and it went on to do modest work at the box office. Talk of the Mothman would never fade away, eventually leading the supposed creature to become a part of West Virginia lore. Many have claimed to spot the Mothman before other similar accidents or tragedies. The most notable of these is known as the Chernobyl blackbird, a creature allegedly spotted hours just before the major nuclear meltdown in Russia. Neither the Grinning Man named Cold or the Mothman can be proven to have existed, which is why this story is, and likely always will be, unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unresolved Podcast. I have to admit, the Mothman is the story I had in mind when I began to think of this podcast, so I hope that I did it justice. It's such an interesting, unique phenomenon that I wanted to put some time and effort into it, but I also wanted to get some experience podcasting about unsolved mysteries before doing so. The Mothman is likely something we'll never get to the bottom of, because it's just so unexplained. Hundreds of people claiming to see similar things in a small area over such an isolated period of time is hard to overlook, even if you attribute it to mass hysteria. So this has just always been something that's left me aching to know more of, or at least wish for a time machine so I could go back and experience it for myself. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, as it was personally a lot of fun for me to get going. I know it was a bit of a departure going from 4 episodes about serial killing rapists to a paranormal cryptid, but I hope to cover a little bit of everything with this podcast. So thank you for listening. I do appreciate it more than you'll ever know. Also, thank you all for the kind words and the support. I appreciate reading all of your comments and messages, even your suggestions. They all help fuel me to try and make this podcast bigger and better every single week. If you want to stay in contact with me, you could do so on social media. You could find me at twitter.com/unresolvedp or at facebook.com/theunresolvedpodcast. This can really come in handy when it comes to updates and stories, such as the news that the FBI has reopened the investigation into the East Area rapist. You would have learned that a few days ago if you would have followed me on social media. Hint, hint. You could also get a hold of me by emailing me at theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. So for you old-timers like myself that are intimidated by things like Twitter, you could keep in touch that way. I would really like to thank all of the musical artists that have contributed to this podcast, including Ailsa Traves, who personally contributed the song you're hearing now. She made it just for this podcast, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. Links to all the songs can be found on the podcast website, theunresolvedpodcast.com. You can also find a transcript of the podcast there, along with links to the many resources I used to put this podcast together. So again, thank you all very much for listening. I plan on getting a little spookier with the next episode, dipping my toes into international waters for some Australian true crime. But until then, stay safe and have a happy start to the holiday season.